Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Reparation Information Thought Series. Today, we are so excited because we're having a conversation with millennial activists in the reparations movement. But first, I want to let you know what this is. The Reparation Information Thought Series is co-hosted by the Reparation Education Project, led by Nikiti Taifa, and the National Black Cultural Information Trust. The Reparation Information Thought Series is a periodic strategic webinar featuring reparations experts, racial justice thought leaders, and you engaged in critical discussion, reflection, and analysis on issues pertinent to the movement for reparatory justice in the United States and abroad. And now we're going to hear more from Nikiti Taifa.
Okay, so again, welcome. And before I introduce our esteemed panelists, I just have a word of disclaimer. I have no idea how old any of the participants are, including my co-host, Jessica Ann Mitchell-Arrowa. I just know that I happen to be a baby boomer. And everybody else is a little bit younger than me. So folk may or may not be in the millennial. You all can clarify that as we proceed. But we really felt it important that this issue, which has been so long-standing, ensure that the next generation is very well entrenched in it. And we looked around and we saw, yeah, they are very much entrenched in it. So we wanted to really have a feature on the next generation, I guess you could say, of reparationists who are really knocking it out of the ballpark and really doing it. So again, we welcome everyone who has come to be part of this webinar. We encourage you, if you have any questions, you can put them in the Q&A box. We don't have a live chat for audience, but we encourage any of the panelists, if you want to put anything in the chat for the community at large, be my guest. So I'm going to introduce our esteemed panelists for this reparation education, reparation information thought series. And then they'll have about 8 minutes to make their remarks. We're going to ask a couple of questions, and then we're going to open it up for Q&A. Is that okay, folks? Okay. So we have Nicole Carty is the first person I'm going to be introducing. Nicole Carty is the executive director of Get Free. Okay, she is the executive director of Get Free, a youth-led movement focused on repairing past harms, removing ongoing barriers to equality, and realizing a future where freedom is for all. She is a movement strategist, a digital organizer, a campaigner, and a trainer born and raised in Atlanta, Georgia, and has over a decade of experience studying and supporting movements to further racial, gender, and economic justice. We're going to also hear from Kevin Cosney. He is the associate director and co-founder of the California Black Power Network, CBPN, where he supports an amazing team of organizers, policy experts, and communicators to build the Black political power needed to transform living conditions for Black Californians. He has been involved in the abolitionist movement since 2008 as one of the founding members of Active Students Against Prisons and Policing at UCR, and one of the founding members of Justice for Trayvon Martin, Los Angeles, now Black Lives Matter of Los Angeles. Welcome, Kevin Cosney. We also have Miranda Alexandria, an influencer and thought leader known as Queen AFUSA, who focuses on educating, entertaining, and empowering everyone in the areas of justice, freedom, and peace for all. As a Chicago native, her life's purpose is to serve by thinking of creative solutions to complex problems that adversely affect her community. Her educational background includes political science, criminal law, and justice, with a concentration in city politics and Black studies. She's taken on several key leadership roles in organizations around the city, including what brings her today as the co-chairwoman of Incobra's Chicago chapter. That's the National Coalition of Blacks for Reparations in America. Welcome, my sister. Trevor Smith is a writer, a researcher, a strategist focused on topics such as racial inequality, wealth inequality, reparations, and narrative change. He is the incoming executive director at the Narrative Power Incubator, a new culture change tank building narrative infrastructure along progressive social movements to shift perceptions and give rise to liberated cultures. He is currently the director of narrative change at Liberation Ventures, a field builder fueling the movement for Black-led racial repair, where he is building the Reparations Narrative Lab, the first of its kind creative space designed to build narrative power behind reparations. And he's also the creator, curator, and editor of a fabulous newsletter titled Reparations Daily-ish. Hey, Trevor. Dreisen Heath. Okay. We're going to say some was instead of is, but Dreisen Heath was a researcher and advocate in Human Rights Watch's United States program examining and advocating on racial justice issues in the U.S. context. She led Human Rights Watch's domestic research and advocacy on reparations and reparatory justice. Dreisen's most recent research endeavor documented what many community members in Tulsa, Oklahoma call, quote, the continuing massacre, conditions of pervasive inequality and structural violence stemming from the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre, one of the worst incidents of racial violence in U.S. History. And Dreisen has a bachelor's degree from Wesleyan University, and she is known as a reparationist and reparations expert. And she is also the founder of the Why We Can't Wait Coalition. Greetings, Dreisen. Oh my goodness. Last but totally and completely not least, Sister Lilly X. She is a true millennial, and she enjoys being a bridge between many generations. Being an intergenerational organizer is what led her to find Cobra as a curious reparations advocate in 2018. And she has become a full-blown reparationist after receiving mentorship from many and attending Cobra's 2019 convention in Detroit. In 2020, she was officially appointed as the National Youth Commission co-chair and has served in this role with her male co-chair, Brother H.A. Jabbar, ever since her appointment. She has developed a strategic plan to engage youth, young adults, and young people as a whole across the nation for the mission of full repair via reparations. And most recently, the Cobra Youth Commission was rebranded to be named, quote, the young people of Cobra to encompass the everlasting youthfulness of our people and expand the lines of intergenerational organizing. And I love that theme of, what did we just say? The everlasting youthfulness, because I feel youthfulness is everlasting. So I'm going to turn it back over to Jam, who's going to present the framing for the discussion amongst our activists. And we will just, if we can, just go in the order in which I introduce you. So after she gives a framing, I'll just call on you one by one. All right, Jam, take it away. Jam is also Jessica Ann Mitchell Abuwar, affectionately known as Jam.
Thanks, Nikichi. So we really wanted to hear from millennial activists on, and Nikichi said this earlier, 8 to 10 minutes each, but how did you get involved in the reparations movement? What was your entry point? What are your thoughts on the current reparations landscape? And since there are more and more emerging leaders in the reparations space, including yourselves, how do you think the millennial and Gen Z and future generations help the movement or can help the movement for reparations evolve? I know I just asked a lot just then. You don't have to answer everything all at once, but I think some of the answers to those questions will come out in your discussion about your work.
Okay, so let's go on and start with Nicole Carty, the executive director of Get Free.
Thanks, Nkichi. And yes, youthfulness is everlasting, especially in you, I would say. A very youthful energy. But I will characterize myself as millennial, 1988. That's dead center. So yes, my name is Nicole Carty. I am a millennial organizer for reparations, and I'm the executive director of Get Free, which is a youth-led movement to repair past harms, remove ongoing barriers to equality, and realize a future where freedom is for all. And my background is really in movement organizing. I kind of entered formally into existing movement infrastructure during 2011 during Occupy Wall Street. So my first exposure to mass movements, and that was a movement about wealth inequality foundationally, right? When I was there, I asked questions about, hey, you know what? There's something missing from this framework. It's about the way that wealth is not just only unequally distributed across the 1% and 99%, but the place of Black people, the legacy of slavery, and the wealth distribution there. And so that is part of where I first got my wheels turning. And then, of course, a few years later, I was helpful in lifting up Movement for Black Lives in 2013 and 14. And my experience in both those movements and studying movement history and best practices for movements really led me to the question of where's the intersection of these movements? Where's the intersection between M for BL and Occupy? And ever since I began to ask that question, I was hooked on our clarity and our need for reparations and a mass movement to actually back reparations and make that a political and public priority. And that was a kernel in my mind for a long time. I've stood up a lot of youth-led movement and other organizations that had successfully shifted narrative on very entrenched issues. In the intervening years after I had that realization. But then in 2019, we began to build out what was formerly under the moniker of Project Truth, Reconciliation, and Reparations, and became Get Free out. And so we spent 3 years really looking at the ecosystem of reparations movement and seeing, let's make sure that we're not, replicating efforts that already exist. We're making something, making an intervention, building something that will be helpful to the field. And we planned this Black-led multiracial movement to actually mainstream repair in the population. Because one thing that we saw when we were looking out is that there was a lack of political will. And we knew that in order to create political will for reparations, we needed to make it a public priority. And to make something a public priority, we would need to organize direct action and organize young people and make a case for why reparations was the obvious thing to do, not just for Black people, but for the country as a whole, if we were ever going to win it as an issue. And we finished building that plan early this year and spent a couple months filling out the infrastructure for Get Free and launched in July of this year. And so we've been fully up and running, small and mighty team, looking to grow for a couple of months. And we are in the process of organizing and training young people all over the country to be hubs for creating the clarity nationally that reparations is an obvious priority. We just had our first training setting up a hub in New York last weekend, and we're about to go to 6 or 7 other places. Thank you, Trevor, for the applause. We're about to go across the country, down to DC, over to California. Would love to connect to you, Kevin, about that. And are setting up hubs to kind of advance this narrative and really get people organized to do direct action, to tie together what reparations has to do with the kind of attacks that are happening against our freedoms that are happening all across the country, because it's the same issue, right? We had young people rising up for repair, for reckoning, honestly, in mass in 2020. And we know our generation understands the root of our issues, the root of white supremacy, and they want to fix those problems. And reparations is the solution to that. And so we know our base is out there. We're trying to organize them into a plan that will not just create reparations as a public priority, but harness the energy of the once in a generational shift that's about to happen in the electorate. So right now, what is happening is there's a shift going on in who is the voting majority. Millennials are already a giant bucket of voters, and they have more radical, more clear politics than any generation before them. And hot on their heels are Gen Z, who are going to be entering the electorate in the next 10 years. These two generations together have the ability to transform our system from top to bottom, and to actually these are generations that are educated about white supremacy. They have a history about systemic racism, and we are trying to organize those folks into making reparations a generational priority and leveraging that power to make it a political priority in the next 5 years. And so that's a little bit about the moment that we're in, is one that is in the wake of the largest youth moment for reckoning in American history, the largest protest moment in American history, and building the we at Get Free are building the infrastructure to harness that energy, funnel it strategically to be able to make repair a priority in the years to come. This is a lot of the things that we're seeing across the country are a backlash to that moment that happened in 2020. And where there's backlash, there's actually opportunity for more organizing. And so we're in a target-rich environment, and the work we're doing is to pull people into a coherent plan to take our outrage into policy and then entrench reparations into our political fabric for the decades to come.
All right.
I feel like I talked at length, but that is me. Thank you, Nkechi, and I'll be done.
Good.
Great.
Thank you so very much, Nicole Carty, Executive Director of Get Free, for sharing. We're going to go now to Kevin Cosney, the Associate Director and Co-founder of the California Black Power Network. Take it away, Kevin Cosney.
Thank you. So I'll try to cover all the points of how I got here, where we are, and where we're headed. So again, Kevin Cosney, he and his California Black Power Network. You know, a lot of my entry point into this work started at a very young age. I grew up really fighting white supremacists, neo-Nazis, police profiling, right? That was my experience as a young person growing up. I had to learn very quickly at a young age to go from fighting with my fists and other weapons to fighting with my mind and my words. And that's what got me into organizing in generally. And then really it was just kind of following the thread, following the seeds left for us to dig into really understand how do we get to systemic change, right? And how deep does this stuff go? And really understanding how deeply rooted everything is, right? That's what got me into abolitionists, right? And I think the abolitionist framework is really important in understanding our current criminal justice system as outgrowth and really a direct connection, right, from slavery, right? And I think that kind of logic and framework is really helpful for all of the work that we do now, even in organizing with and for Black folk, is to understand that the issues that we're dealing with are deeply rooted in all of the kind of anti-Black systems that America has set up from slavery up until present day, right? And so a lot of our work has been, how do we undo that? How do we really develop a framework that allows folk to understand the historical starting point of all of the issues that our communities are facing. And so it was kind of a natural progression, right? For me, abolitionist work is one of the pillars, right, of reparations, right? Cessation and non-repetition, right? And so it was, even without me seeing myself as a reparationist, right, I think that was critical, and it's a really important pillar of that work. And I think there's a direct tie. And I think the fact that a lot of us are kind of calling out this 2013, 2014 time, right, is indicative of what the movement space and the energy does, right? When you start telling truth, it becomes contagious, right? And so I think part of what got us here to this moment and part of this landscape is this movement moment that we're in, that has been unapologetically Black, has been unapologetic in its calling out of the truth and history of how we got here, and really what is the root cause of a lot of our issues. And so I think that kind of brings us to this point where now, particularly organizationally speaking, right, for the California Black Power Network, reparations is really the entry point that allows us to, in the deepest way possible, talk about the various other issues that we're concerned about, whether we're talking about criminal justice, whether we're talking about housing, talking about education, right? The list goes on and on and on, democracy, et cetera, et cetera. It all kind of comes back to this fundamental point, right? And for us, it certainly serves as one opportunity for us to deeply heal and liberate our people, but finally start to address these questions and these issues and these problems that have plagued us for generations. And so we think there's a huge opportunity here to push this forward and really break open and make progress amongst a number of issue areas. And so I think that's why we're really prioritizing this fight and really centering it as the kind of entry point for all the things that we do. I think the moment that we're in right now, again, is very much a movement moment. And I don't think we would have the opportunities we have if it wasn't for that energy in the streets and the, again, unapologetic truth-telling that we're seeing. I think we have the most opportunity that we've had in a long time, if not ever, to make this a dream a reality. I think there are, I think historically, right, there's always these ebbs and flows. And there are some that just kind of keep the flame alive, and those who are able to kind of light the torch and take it for miles. And so I think we're at a point now, and I think this panel in particular, and some of the spaces that I met folk in previously, right, I think are really important to show and know that this is a continuum, right, a long spectrum, a long history of work, and we're standing on the shoulders of giants, and that there's a lot of history and lessons to be learned. And I think that's really pivotal because, like every movement, when there's a kind of revitalization, sometimes there is a tendency to repeat things that have already been done, repeat mistakes that have already been done. And I think this space is really important because we can skip some of those steps, right? There's lessons that we can take on and move forward and be ahead of the game. We don't have to relearn all of these things. I think there is a danger, right, where I think some folks are disconnected from that history and have been pushing for more narrow readings, right, of reparations and what it could look like. And there's a number of dangers there, from the rhetoric that comes with that to really a narrow reading of history. And if you're not reading history correctly, if you're not telling the true story, the full story, we can't really ask for full repair if we're not clear on the full harms. And so I think it is important that we continue to pass the lessons on, pick up from where things were left off, and continue to drive this in the full kind of vision that our ancestors and those who came before us have had for us. I think we'll probably talk about this a lot, but I think in regards to young people, today, I guess, I don't know if we all have to qualify our millennialness. I'm an 86 baby. Don't let the gray hairs fool you. But I am a millennial. That said, I think one of the things that I think, we always generally see that young people are more progressive, more radical, more willing to say the truth, right? Generally, there's just less baggage, right, that we have in the world. But I think what makes this generation even more powerful in that is the access to knowledge that we have, right? They say the revolution will not be televised, but I think it might be on TikTok, right? Like, just seeing how persuasive that platform has been. Right. So again, some of us have been doing Black Lives Matter work and movement for Black Lives work since 2013. And the shift that we saw and the types of conversations I saw in 2020 relative to the other 7 years leading up to that were hugely different. I think even now, as we see what's happening in Palestine, right, the types of conversations that are happening on TikTok spaces versus what mainstream media is pushing out are worlds apart, right? And so I think the tools that young people have amassed to spread information rapidly, right, I think is a huge potential in how we get out the information, tell the story, and galvanize other folk around it. I certainly think one of the things that we're up against now is a huge push, right? We see this push against CRT and removal of basic parts of our history. And now you see folks saying, well, why do we need reparations? That was a long time ago. That didn't impact yada, yada, right? So that history, that's telling of stories of not only the past harms, but the current harms, I think is imperative. And I think young people are really poised to do that. I think in Oakland a few months ago, we talked about how do we take all of the wealth of information and digitize that to allow that to be in the hands of people in a way that folk can move. So I'll stop there. I think my 8 minutes are up.
You're muted, Nikichi.
There we go. Not pressing the buttons, right? I say thank you so very much, Kevin. Kevin with the California Black Power Network. And now we're going to hear from Miranda Alexandria, also known as Queen AF, from the Chicago, in COBRA's Chicago chapter. She's the chairwoman.
Well, first of all, can y'all hear me? Trying to make sure I got my timer so I don't go over time, okay? So with that being said, yes, my name is Miranda, also known as Queen AF, and I'm going to tell you right now, my journey to the reparations work is very subjective about what I saw in my life in Chicago. And it was interesting when I got to college, specifically UIC, and I realized that, oh, what has been going on in the past is still happening now. What? And then next thing you know, it's when I came to the realization that there has been war placed upon our bodies. And then I started to get really mad and I got really frustrated, but I said, okay, hold on. What can I channel my anger into? What can I channel the passion into? Because when you work in the city of Chicago and you are constantly running people around the city doing Uber and Lyft, you get to hear so many stories, but you also get to see how people are interacting with each other in this space, especially when dealing with race. Some of the most interesting racial experiences that I've had happened in an Uber. And I was just like, wow, I come from a very middle class background. Mother's a nurse, father's a cop. And it was just, especially when you find out my father's a police, you're kind of like, well, how do you reconcile doing anti-police work with your father's a cop? And it's like, but you have to understand the type of cop my father was. He was actually so much better a cop than a father, but that's more personal things that as an influencer, I can't wait till you find out on my channel, right? So it's one of those things when you understand who my father was, he actually policed for the community. And that becomes the thing. Police are not policing for the community. They're policing to, let's just say, carry out an agenda. Right. And that's how I'll frame that, because we all know, especially in Chicago, which different organizations who I've been able to come into contact with, such as EAT, Equity and Transformation, who have worked so hard in the space of getting reparations specifically for police victims of torture. So it's one of those things that coming up in this space and living in this particular city, which I'm not going to say is the most segregated city in the United States, but I'm pretty sure we're ranking top 5, right? Because of the way that our political landscape was held for so many years. We were under machine politics, which is very different from a lot of spaces within the nation. So all I can say is that coming into this space and into this reparation space, especially as a influencer, which I would just say, just imagine if Harriet Tubman had a TikTok, or imagine if Sojourner Truth had a TikTok. Imagine if Ida B. Wells had an Instagram, right? So just imagine how these movements would be able to move with that type of energy that the young people bring to the table, because it's so difficult, because I'm in Chicago as I'm working to build one of the most intergenerational chapters, which I know Philly is right up there right now. So, but as we come through to build intergenerationality within Chicago, I believe that just so much can be done. There is so many things that can happen, because I'm not going to toot our own horn, but Lincoln, even though we got our problems with him, but he came from Illinois. And of course, Barack Obama, he comes from Chicago. So we are so excited to see what we can do in this city to drive our cause forward. Because at the end of the day, for people to enslave people, and then after that, not give them any resources to be able to make it. And then on top of that, you are now going to criminalize us and make it seem as if we deserve the type of treatment that we have to have endured through all this time. We're talking about centuries. We're talking about generations. So when we're talking about reparations, one of the things that I love as the youth is to be able to bring so much creative, energy and thoughts, and how we can actually make this happen. Now, I'll say for this, also as an influencer in Chicago, as Queen AF, one of the things that I do is I go out to our expressways, the area off the expressways, and I clean them up, because they are very dirty. But best believe, when I clean them up, I'm dressed like this, if not better, because people need to know I am not a part of SWAP. And SWAP is our clean up the side of the highway crew in Chicago. So I don't know, I have to backtrack, make sure y'all know the Chicago lingo, slang. Look, I'm putting words together all day long. So with that being said, it comes down to showing us what do we need to do for our own healing, which I think I've heard in a lot of conversations, is how do we do this simultaneous reparatory process where we do a lot of inner work, but we're still making sure that the people who have inflicted these harms upon us are being held accountable, which I think becomes the most important thing, right? But at the same time, once we get the reparations, how are we repairing? Let's start that thinking process now. And that is some of the some of the work that we are doing currently in Chicago, to work on what this space looks like once it's done. Because we talk about land, all I can say is that a lot of people live in the southern and western part of Chicago. We can go ahead and create some boundaries right then and there and start to actually see how reparations in our own land and where we're currently living can now start to play out in reality. Because like Kevin said, we're turning dreams into reality out here. I believe in making the impossible possible. And how we're going to do that, I think the future is the only way to really be able to imagine. We have to imagine our future, and knowing that when we are not making the same mistakes as the generations before us, we are now looking to prime generations after us to say, hey, what are you going to do in this space? Because even when we attain one thing, how are you going to make sure that this process continues? Because we know all too well that they will roll some stuff right back. So we're working on being diligent in understanding the landscape that we are traversing as millennials. And I'm just so excited. And just to let y'all know, yes, I am in the millennial category. I'm right there, 89. So, I tell people I'm an 80s baby all the time. And they be like, no, you wasn't. But yes, I was. So 89 is definitely in the building. And I'm just so excited. And thank you so much for having me on.
All right, my sister, thank you so much. And I'm going to use some of those quotes about Harriet Tubman with the TikTok, Ida B. Wells with the Instagram. So, hey, I like that. So that was Miranda Alexandria, also known as Queen AF's Chicago and COBA co-chairperson. And so now we're going to bring on Trevor Smith, a reparationist. Okay, he is the incoming Reparations Daily, excuse me. He's the incoming executive director at the Narrative Power Incubator, and he's currently the director of narrative change at Liberation Ventures. Take it away, Trevor.
Thank you. And such a pleasure to be amongst such a great group of folks. So I was my way into the reparations space and conversation. I'd always been a proponent, or in college, I was the person saying, I don't think Black people should pay taxes. And my friends would laugh at me. And then when Ta-Nehisi Coates came out with the case for reparations, I think that was like 2014. So that was my junior year of college. I remember having a conversation with my parents saying, like, I think that I'll be able to work on this like full time. And they laughed at me. So it is really funny to be able to be at a point where that has come to fruition. And I'm so grateful that has happened. And my parents are so supportive of me now. But I think that that is indicative of how reparations has been seen. And I think it's why narrative and culture change is so important. For so long, it's been kind of framed and shown as a joke in pop culture and throughout history. And then the kind of actualization of it came when I was working at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, which is a think tank in DC working on kind of like economic policy. And I was a media strategist doing outreach on papers and research. And I worked on this paper I'm about to drop in the chat that was written by Dr. Derek Hamilton, Dr. Sandy Darity. And through that, I started to dive into their research around the racial wealth gap. So my real entry point into the reparations conversation is kind of from like the economist lens of closing the racial wealth gap. And, forming a relationship with Dr. Darity, Dr. Hamilton, I moved to New York. I reached out to them. I moved to New York for grad school. I reached out to them wanting to see if they needed any support. Dr. Darity had just started to work on this project that ended up becoming this book that was just released called the Black Reparations Project, where he was hoping to gather a bunch of academics that would write about reparations from different angles. Through that research, I was looking into the media's role in anti-Black harm. And so traced kind of the history of minstrel shows and the ways in which minstrel shows have kind of cemented and perpetuated anti-Black stereotypes. Once minstrel shows went away, obviously anti-Black racism didn't go away, and that showed up in our pop culture. And then there was an interesting point in which, Black culture started to be celebrated, but of course, Black folks don't really have a lot of ownership in Black media or in the media landscape. And so even though Black culture is being celebrated and we started to see more and more Black faces in pop culture, the lack of ownership increased the racial wealth gap. And so that was some of the research that I was starting to look into. I'd always had an interest in philanthropy. After grad school, I luckily got a job at the Cerna Foundation, which is a family foundation based in New York, where I was on the inclusive economies team working on increasing access to capital for Black and Brown entrepreneurs, and funding groups that are doing kind of labor organizing, economic policy. And I started in March 2020. So I was in the office for like 3 days. COVID hit, and I was a virtual employee. And my boss at the time, she saw, I should say, in the first kind of couple weeks, that pretty much overnight, folks that were being labeled as low-wage workers or low-skilled workers overnight started to be called essential workers. And so she saw that narrative change in a couple of weeks. And so she tasked me with looking into who are the groups out there kind of reframing how people think about the economy in this time. And so that was my kind of first delve into this narrative change space, folks who are using different resources and organizing skills to reframe how people think about things. And then, right as that was happening, I saw groups like Decolonizing Wealth, Liberation Ventures started to get started up. I had this idea or this thought of, what would it look like to build narrative infrastructure within a movement, which to me, it's like my first job out of college was at a PR firm called M&R that works with social justice organizations. And they provide and increase the capacity of the groups that we work with. So what would it look like to essentially, do in-house or have a movement have like in-house communications and narrative capacity. And, you know, it's been done before. Blackbird, I think, is another good example, and there are other examples of it. So I had this idea of an organization called the Reparations Narrative Lab. I met the co-founders of Liberation Ventures, Aria and Alan, pretty early in my conversations about it. They wanted to do narrative change. So I brought the idea of the lab into Liberation Ventures. So over the past year, I've worked with 13 activists across the movement. Dreisen was one of them, who participated in the lab to co-create this narrative framework that we hope can be a tool to kind of help folks across the racial and social justice space more easily enter into the reparations conversation and also know what we're up against. So we named as a collective kind of 10 narrative roadblocks, essentially the most common counter arguments from our viewpoint, that we hear about reparations, and that we hope that the narrative framework can be a tool to not only overcome these roadblocks, but also build a transformative narrative and help us build narrative power together. So that's kind of my journey. I think the next thing that I'll name, or one of the last things that I'll name, is my thoughts on the landscape and how we can get more young people involved. You know, my thoughts on the landscape, for me personally, I felt so welcomed into this space from elders. I know that that's not the experience across the board, but for me personally, I felt so welcome into this space. And I hope that it's something that that we can take the torch that's being passed to us and pass it down to younger folks. So I'm 29 years old, but I really know and hope that folks that are 13, 14, 15, 16 can have reparations on their lips. You know, I'm thinking about not even Gen Z, Gen Alpha, which is the generation that's coming up right now. I'm thinking about them as like the reparations generation. You know, they might be the first generation that grows up with an actual understanding of the transformative ways and movement of reparations, right? So I really became politicized on the topic in college, but what would it look like for young Black kids to be politicized on this topic in elementary school, to know what reparations is, and not just in the economic sense? You know, I really think about reparations as a political, cultural, and economic project that seeks to transform society. And so one of the ways in which I try to do that is through my newsletter, Reparations Daily-ish, also thinking about it as like an infrastructure project. The thought was, how can we provide media monitoring to the movement? So I knew from the jump that I wouldn't be able to do it every day. So that's why I said daily-ish. But I compile clips of reparations news from across the country. Well, now it's across the globe. And then a couple months in, I started to write opinion pieces. And then now I've started to do like quarterly printed pieces. And I see that as a real way to try to engage an array of folks, particularly young folks, right? So the online newsletter, you have to self-select into it. You have to go online, find it, subscribe to it. But with this, I can go up to someone and have a conversation with them and hand it to them and ask, like, have you heard about reparations? You know, what do you know about it? Are you interested in it? And hand them this newsletter. And so this fall edition actually has Nkechi in it. It has some other folks in it from across the movement. It has some framing activities from the Reparations Narrative Lab that we did. And yeah, I think that if we're able to bring young folks in, when we think about culture change, who drives culture? Young people. And so I do think it's really, really important for us to provide the space for young people to enter this movement, because it is young people that drive music, that drive sports, and they're the next leaders of our generation. And so I'm not even thinking about Gen Z, I'm thinking about Gen Alpha and how we can get reparations in the classroom, particularly at a time when we're facing an anti-history movement that's taking Black history out of the classroom. So I'll end with that. Just appreciate being in the space, as always.
So thank you so very much, Trevor Smith, the incoming executive director at the Narrative Power Incubator. And we will be looking forward towards reparations. What is it called? Gen Alpha, the reparations generation. Yes. Okay, so now we're going to hear from my sister Dreisen Heath, the reparationist expert, I would call her, and the director of the Why We Can't Wait Coalition. Dreisen.
Thank you, Nikichi, and just gratefulness to you and Jam for this series, but for your larger, investment in this movement, in this space, and in youth leadership, in supporting others to be just as much a part of this movement. So I'm grateful for that. Yeah, coming into this work, how do you get involved? I mean, I think part of it is, ancestral connection, like something you don't have a real choice to say no to, because you're guided to the work. And I believe that's part of my story, with families, enslaved in Trapped, Maryland and Cotton Plant, Arkansas, knowing that my late grandmother, left Little Rock, Arkansas, at the height of, some of the racial violence and segregation, or, integration, where there was still violence, and being displaced up north, understanding those dynamics, seeing mass death around me, growing up, seeing, my family members not making it past 75 years old, but all my white friends, all their, peoples are like 99 and above. Seeing those kinds of life expectancy disparities, seeing how my blood and chosen families are affected by inequalities, experiencing that inequality directly, my entire childhood, into, high school and college years. And so, even in high school, I was born in Tulsa, but didn't grow up there. So even learning about Tulsa was out of body experience, and one where my parents in kid language would be like, something bad happened there and we're going to take you back eventually. But I never went back. What brought me back was the killing of Terrence Crutcher by the Tulsa police in 2016. And so just to be, reoriented with your birthplace by the continuation of this violence is, also something that means, a lot to me and runs through me. In college, leaving in the middle of basketball season, preseason, to go to Ferguson, after Mike Brown was killed. A whole bunch of organizing in college and doing thesis work around the more secrets of the civil rights movement within the dynamics between, Black women leaders and Black male leaders, and, who was recognized and who was suppressed, and where the violence was happening against Black women in particular, and how that has had generational psychological impacts on us. Research that I feel like could help us avoid pitfalls of repeating in our current movement, of, intra-violence amongst each other. And then, coming into this space more formally through HR 40 advocacy, having the opportunity to, support through Human Rights Watch, my time at Human Rights Watch, building up their domestic reparations program, studying international human rights law. The right to reparation is clearly outlined. The same way you have a right to food and a right to health and a right to education, right to development, you have a right to reparation. So that felt like a clear path of work in support of HR 40. Of course, and another extended body of work supporting Tulsa directly, including, the last known living survivors. We lost one recently in Uncle Red, Mr. Hughes Van Ellis, at 102 years young. He says he's going to fight 30 more years. But we also have 109-year-old Viola Ford Fletcher, and then Leslie Benningfield Randall will be 109 as well on November 10th. So, just like these years, how can they even survive this long? And just having this, real sense of duty to see it through. We're talking about the most documented massacre there was, right? Not even, no questions. People were selling postcards about this shit after. Right. And so we know who's accountable. The institutions are still alive, and yet we haven't seen reparations in one of the most clearest instances of mass violence and terrorism. And so also within the HR 40 advocacy, we were in a pretty intense period where it was like, okay, this might actually be voted on, right? It had never been voted out of committee, thanks to the work of Cobra and others of getting it to the place that it was, even evolving the bill language to a more actionable roadmap that the federal government would produce, got the Judiciary Committee vote, but even having the votes to pass on the floor, still, the institution won't do it, right? And so, but even to get there, we needed a coalition. There needed to be more access to this space from, organizations that wanted to put resources and energy into this fight, right? There's some education to come into this space first, but where is the space we're going to create to actually have a strategic movement outside of just ourselves? Like, everything we've ever attained in this life has been across ethnicity lines, across age lines, across gender lines. And so there needed to be a more exclusive movement. And that's where the Why We Can't Wait coalition came in, where, we have over 720 organizations participating at all different capacities. Some are really into the details. Some are like, send me the action alert when it's time to go. Also, more recently, helping develop Representative Cori Bush's Reparations Now resolution, which, folks will say, why are you doing a resolution? We don't need none of that anymore. We need direct implementation. Well, that was the plan. The plan was to have a more direct omnibus reparations bill. And, you all wouldn't guess what hell is going through just to get a resolution, right? So I will say that is still a historic feat in itself that outlines what reparations could actually look like. If we did have a federal commission, what would they look into? What could the possible remedies look like? And so this gap between what we know and what's possible in terms of reparations is something, that I know all of the people here are dedicated towards closing. I'll just end by saying, in terms of, where we're at, I mean, that's a whole dissertation. But, we're in a really grave moment. I feel the intensity every single day of, what we're going through globally, right? The diaspora is going through globally. Mm-hmm. And how, within the US even, we don't have the community built infrastructure that we need to even disseminate resources. If we got reparations tomorrow and they were like, here's your multi-trillion-dollar package, we'd have no institutions built. We'd have, some strategic plans around it, but we're not connected yet to do that. And so that's why I feel, young people have a responsibility here to, for us to reach back, right? Because I'm also grateful to have had arms around me coming in, but there was also other people that didn't have arms around you, right? And so we need to create a space where people feel welcomed into this movement, and that their contributions, so long as they're committed to, honoring the work before them, that their contributions are valid and can transform our conditions. So building building authentic relationship is key to that work. The majority of my work is spending time in community directly with people, and, really realizing what that means to them. How do we actually realize this issue of not just, what the government and these institutions, private corporations can give us, but what can we do for ourselves? And so I'm grateful again for this opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Dreisen, leading the Why We Can't Wait Coalition. And now we come to Sister Lilly X. Sister Lilly X, the co-chair of Incobra's Youth Commission, also now called the Young People of Incobra. Take it away, Sister Lilly X.
Thank you very much. I'm so honored to be here. In the beginning, when you was going through everyone's intro, I was like, dang, I ain't right enough, because y'all know you some heavy hitters. So I'm very grateful to be in the room. Also, setting the record straight. Yes, Beyonce is top of the millennial food chain. Summer Walker, if you're into her music, she's one of my favorite millennial vocalists. She's 27. She is the bottom of the true millennial food chain. So I'm just going to put that out there. Do your own research. The 25ers, 26ers, I know it's cool to try to get in where you fit in. You're Gen Z. And Trevor's going to make me do a lot of research on Gen Alpha, which is kind of crazy to think that we're getting into the alpha, beta, delta. Like, that's wild. But that's 2010 to 2024, I believe. So anyone born in that time would be considered Gen Alpha, who I truly agree, those are our future. That's our future generation of reparationists, because at that point, you're not going to have a chance. At that point, we're going to be getting more than a check, but everybody's definitely going to be in line for the check. So, I know the Gen Alpha will definitely have a plan on communicating that to each other. Much like we saw what happened in this last political round when we got a stimulus check, per se. I know that was the most money in my young adult life that I had ever gotten from the federal government. I got excited. I was like, the options are starting to option now. So I think that what everyone has said, I could touch on it a lot. The former teacher in me is gonna start answering some of these questions in the chat that were already jogging my memory, but that is where I got into the movement. I started as a youth, I guess, empowerment person. I was working at an after-school program around the time that Trayvon Martin and Mike Brown were killed. And at that time, I was in shell shock with these young people that I was working with. I'm starting college. I'm a sophomore in college, and I'm working at an after-school program with 6th, 7th, to 8th graders, and they looking at me like, "What do we do?" I'm like, let's make a plan. So, the way that we decided was that we were going to heal. And so at that time, I was very into photography. We got some Skittles, we got some tea, and that's how we honored Brother Trayvon. And then, like I said, unfortunately, we thought, little did I know, I thought this was a one and done. I was like, ooh, America, that was weird. Nope, the ball has kept rolling and has kept rolling. So like many people, I have a criminal justice background, legal advocate background, political organizing background. And I believe it's safe to say that a lot of us are in this work not by choice. Like, we're in it by choice, but we do this liberation work out of trying to liberate ourselves, if I know a little bit about any and everybody on this call. So I think that that's kind of interesting. That's how millennials have kind of fallen into this work. I think it's going to be interesting, and I'm interested to see the data that Trevor's going to collect on what the narrative will be around how Gen Z and Gen Alpha gets into the movement. Because yes, we have TikTok and we have Instagram and Facebook and all these other tools, but we also have to look at the ways that those tools affected us, how we were influenced. I saw somebody had asked about the D9. I'm very grateful about, I'm like, my letter saved me, basically my Black card. Like, I went to a completely white evangelical Christian university. Like, I could have been expelled for dancing. Crazy. So I had to get my Black card. I was like, yo, what they doing over there on the public university? I went to University of Minnesota. Our sorority and fraternity house is right down the street from where Philando Castile was murdered. My best friend's house is right around the corner from where George Floyd was killed. So I understand Queen Dreisen when she talks about not wanting to bring that trauma up, or when you're doing this work and you get back into the work, because your hometown is wilding and it's around police violence and killing Black bodies. And you're like, hold on, this is starting to feel very personal. And so I think that much in the same breath that we entered the movement that way, I do see the other generations, unfortunately, going through the same unfortunate rites of passage, if you could call it that, in a weird Twilight Zone kind of way. Well, I'm into Black Mirror. That's my show. But anyways, you know, and it's really unfortunate. I think I definitely heard in Sister Queen Miranda what she said about when you are in an area like Chicago, where my people are also from, born and raised. I'm a Chicagoan by blood and recently moved home, power to the people. And so you do feel landlocked here. I put it top 3 segregated cities. You know my struggle at work. So it's like, how do we break out of this? How do the youth break out of this? Because when we have things that are going on, like in Florida and Texas, the person in the chat who raised that question, where yes, they can put on the school law books that you have to cut your hair, it could be suspended for your locks. Bye. Or that your cell phone gets taken and you have to pay to get your cell phone back. That's a Texas rule, school rule. What are other ones? Any form of insubordination towards authority or a teacher figure, which is why, again, when we talk about how much effort do we want to continue to put into the Black public school teacher movement or Black charter school, private school teacher movement, or do we need to be creating our own schools? Being someone who is in Cobra, you know, I feel extremely humbled and honored to be here before Queen. She'll kill me if I ever call her Queen Mother, but Queen Mother Nikichi, soon to be Queen Mother Nikichi, who assisted in the founding of NCOBRA as a young reparationist. You know, we are literally following in her footsteps. And so that's inspiring, that's powerful, to know that, again, NCOBRA was founded on ideologies that had to do with the new Republic of Africa, if I'm saying that correct, and us even having our own land and sovereignty. I don't want that to get out the conversation. I'm also with you on the taxes, Trevor. I don't want that to get out of the conversation. I think we are in the perfect place as young people, however you identify. My co-chair, 45. So however you identify, we are in the perfect position, a prime position to ask for whatever we want. They have never asked us for what we want. Let's just start there. But they have always taken what they've wanted. And I think that now it is time for us to take what we deserve, what we want and what we deserve. Because again, and I was doing my notes, I told you I'm a teacher, so I was pulling it up. Let's go to the international human rights law. Again, I told you I work on police accountability. I'm over here like I got more work to do because it says right here, we are the people's police force. If the current police force is engaged in human rights violations, then we have the right and responsibility to disband and replace them. Brutality, arbitrary arrests, and many actions. That's against, again, our 14th Amendment, which someone brought up, which is all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and the state wherein they reside. I know I was born on this land. I know my people were born on this land. And even if you don't know, I attended the St. Paul meeting that you held, Sister Nikichi. And because again, that's home for me. You know, I be trying to move in the cracks because I'm still trying to learn. And that was news for me to learn that there are people who are truly invested in the divisiveness of who touched this soil, when you touch this soil, where you touch this soil. So I think the 1970 example that was brought up was perfect, you know, because so that is where a lot of young people per se could at least start to try to formulate something. You know, when you start trying to go back to early 1900s, early 1800s, good luck. Look, I'd be doing my research. I ain't even gonna do that much research. So we have to make it accessible for young people. We have to make it accessible for our people. We have to meet people where we're at. What do we say when you come to the church? Come as you are. And people surely be coming as they are, depending on what church you go to. So look, my people from the Garden, super South Side Chicago, one of the last possible streets to be considered city of Chicago. That's where my family church is. And so yes, people be coming as they are. And that's how we need to open the space up for our young people to come into the work, and our intergenerational people. So I just want to put it there. Hopefully I checked off some of these questions.
Well, you did great. And we're about to get into some more questions. So Sister Lilly X, co-chair of the Incoba Youth Commission, thank you so very much. And I just want to let people know, I was 20 years old in this picture, and I had already been in the reparations movement for several years before that. So it was young people really that brought this movement into the modern era, sitting on the shoulders of people like Imari Obadeli and Queen Mother Audley Moore and Chokwe Lumumba and others. So I'm going to turn it over to Jam, and she's going to ask you all a quick question for you to be just quickly popcorn respond to, and then we're going to look at some of the questions in the Q&A. But we really want to thank all of you all for coming and sharing. We need more of these dialogues like this. So Jessica?
Sure. Let's see. In 10 years, where do you think the reparations movement will be? What type of progress do you think will be made or will have been made? Anyone?
And this is popcorn, because we want to get to this is popcorn. So whoever wants to respond, just come on and bring it up.
Kevin ready.
I'll jump in. My kids are 7 and 9. They're Gen Alpha. 10 years from now, they will be adults. They need to have reparations be a reality.
Anybody else? Miranda, I see you look like you're starting. Oh, that's Sister Lilly. Someone come on out.
I would say I agree. I got some nieces. They are coming up in age. One was a business owner as a teenager, doing hair, all of that. Again, I see a whole generation of business owners, LLCs, tax-free lifestyles, all of that. We can start getting there in 10 years.
I see probably like between 5 to 10 states that have done their own reparations commissions, a la California. And I do think HR 40 will pass in the next 10 years. I have hope.
I sure hope so. Lord, it's already been over 30. Okay, great. Anybody else before Jam looks through the Q&A and broaches something there?
Very quickly, they wouldn't be fighting so hard to rewrite history right now if we weren't already super close. So in 10 years, I do think the reason why they're trying to do all the CRT stuff is because reparations is the common sense response if you understand history. And so that will be, if we win the fight in the next year or so, in 10 years, it will be kind of a done deal. So that's where I am.
Okay, great. Yes. I also want to make sure that the listening audience is looking at the chat. There are great resources that have been put in the chat throughout. Click on them, find out more about the organizations that folk are involved with. And I think, Jam, do we want to look at some of the questions in the Q&A? I'm going to let you take
Sure. One is from Robert Stubblefield. What is the role that local reparation efforts plays in pushing reparations at the national level? Anyone feel free to respond.
So what I would say is that the role that local reparations plays, it's like, if we know that when a lot of things get done in this country, it's done through legislation. And it's like you have to be able to set a precedent for something having been done. Oh no, my internet connection is unstable. Am I okay? Look, I'm
getting better. You were slow for a second.
We okay, thank you. A millennial's worst nightmare not to have no internet. Okay. So All I can say is when it comes to local reparations, you got to start knocking stuff down. As soon as the precedent has been set, next thing you know, now more states are doing it. More states are doing it. So, or even municipalities are doing it, right? So even as we start to grow this movement, it's going to force the hand of the national government to say, hey, okay, so many have done it. Now we have to have a national push. So as we keep setting precedent, it lays more foundation for where we need to go.
Can I add in a bit? I agree with that wholeheartedly, right? It's about the momentum. It's about the organizing and giving us more wins to kind of build on. In that, right, we're learning narrative, right? We're seeing what's coming up against us and we're finding better ways to navigate that. We're learning policy solutions, right? I didn't even really mention our work in California with the task force. We've been heavily involved in the task force, holding listening sessions. And every time we do that, we're learning what reparations could look like, how these policies could become reality, how to drive the political will. And I think the more we do that, the more creative we get, the more momentum we build, the more we can actually have the political will and creativity to make this happen at a national level.
I will say too, it's all about momentum, but also let's be vigilant about the fact that not all these efforts are made equal or are reparations. And so, you know, if it's catching on fire, that also means that there's going to be a lot of people trying to derail it and turn it into something that it's not supposed to be. I'll give you Greenbelt, Maryland is trying to tackle both Native Indigenous reparations and Black reparations in one program. That is just, you know, does a disservice to both of these massive harms. You know, we're going to have an incomplete reparations program as a result of that. Providence, Rhode Island has made it a criteria to, you know, anybody making under 50K, like $50,000 income is going to be eligible under their reparations program. Anybody, 40% of all households in, you know, Providence are white-headed households. So, you know, we have to also educate people on the fact that this doesn't replace the federal government's responsibility to pay in full in all ways. So as long as we're not missing that message with our advocacy and our organizing, then I think, you know, these local efforts can do us well.
Yeah, and I would just tag on the electoral piece that Sister Nicole started speaking on earlier with the work that they're looking to do with Get Free. I know that when I left teaching and got into advocacy and organizing, again, I was politically organizing, learning about the electoral vote, learning why it's important. I was a part of an organization in 2020 where we registered the largest number of youth in Texas, period, in history for Texas. And we did that via college campuses. That was our number one target, which a lot of us have spoken about that before on our different calls and commissions and things like that. And so I think that, again, we have to make the information palatable and interesting and entertaining for the youth, and so that they can regurgitate it and pass it on to each other in a way that's going to make sense to them, in a way that's going to excite them and energize them to want to spread the word about this new thing called reparations, and they can get some, you know, and not just it being oh, well, this is going to be another thing for, like Sister Dreisen said, everybody. Because I think what we did kind of get into with a little bit of the sensitivity of the conversation between the generations was around, I know I can only speak for myself, I do feel slighted as a foundational Black American, African American, Black person who can trace my history back to grandparents that were sharecroppers and living and things like that. I know people who know living people who were enslaved still, but like we said, people are starting to pass on that information, that knowledge, that proof, because we know these people love proof, is starting to move on. And so how do we preserve that in a timely manner so that the work that's being done locally can also match the work that's being done nationally but also on a state level. Politics usually works in threes. And even to pass a policy, you got to have the heart of the people, you have to have the legislation, and then you have to have the actual legislators and the actual body and enough people on your team to get it through. So again, you're already working in systems. And so we need to figure out how to work our wants into the system that is already there and teach that to these other generations coming up within 10 years. You're on mute.
Yeah, we want to keep the responses brief so that we can get in as many questions as possible. And look at the Q&As also. If there's any that's specifically directed to you, that you can just respond to the person, look at that as well. Okay, go on, Jam. What's the next question?
This is S.J. Baker's question. Could you address the fundamental intersection between asserting our right of self-determination, redress of human rights violations, and reparations under international human rights law?
Yeah, I mean,
Dreisen, I said that sounds like you.
Self-determination is pretty, clearly outlined as well. This is your rights to economic, cultural, social, being, development, political practices without interference. Right? That's what self-determination means. And at this point, we've always had interference of our cultural practices, of our political practices, of our access to our rights, full stop. So, in intersecting that then with the right to reparation, which is, restitution, compensation, guarantees of non-repetition, satisfaction, rehabilitation. I think self-determination has to be woven into all 5 of those forms of reparation as outlined in international law. And we've seen other countries, and we've even seen Chicago police torture victims effectively use, things like the Convention Against Torture, which also has the right to reparation embedded in it, in winning cases, right, in U.S. court, for their access to different forms of restitution, compensation, trauma-informed care, as well as education. So it's possible to, further utilize that. But this self-determination piece is something that I think, is a part of the original, I feel like, advocacy and organizing of this movement that people don't quite understand. And I think it's our responsibility to educate folks on what that is and what that feels like. What will that feel like if that's fully embodied by our peoples?
Okay, I'd like to advance a question from Prophet Anyanwu. She's asking, where do you see health, especially holistic and traditional medicine, in the reparations conversation? Does anyone want to tackle
briefly,
that?
and maybe I want to tackle this with another question around complete and full reparations, right? So maybe I'll answer that first and then come full circle, right? One, let's just talk about the nature of capitalism, white supremacy, right? And who holds the levers of power to most institutions in the United States, right? So understanding that a check to Black folk, I mean, Michael Ealy said this in Barbershop, right? A check to Black folk, right, isn't going to stay long in the Black community. We know that. There needs to be efforts to build up institutions, again, for self-determination, et cetera, where we can really fully utilize, right, resources that are brought to us. That said, the harms of slavery and anti-Black racism that we faced over century have not been limited to financial harms, right? We've been brutalized mentally, physically, emotionally. Institutions have been torn down. Every time we try to erect something for ourselves, it is torn down, right? And so there's absolutely a place for all forms of healing. And I think that's an imperative one, right? Particularly one that is rooted in our history, in our culture, and that has been oftentimes erased, right? And delegitimized. So I think there is a need for healing, and literally the word repair, right, is talking about healing, right? And so I think the full and completeness has to have that and so much more. I'll stop there.
And I'll just say that the medical industry has played a huge role in instituting, anti-Blackness. They were the ones that asserted like fake research that our cranium sizes were different. They're the ones that have asserted this notion that Black people are subhuman. And to me, a key part of reparations is uprooting anti-Blackness. The work of reparations isn't over to me until we have uprooted anti-Blackness in all of its forms, and anti-Blackness is a global phenomenon. So I do think, the word racial reckoning was thrown around a lot in 2020, but I don't think we as a society really know what that means, or we haven't really realized what that means. I think those of us in this space kind of knows what that means. And I do think that the medical industry as a whole has a real racial reckoning that needs to happen. And as they go through that, not only should they participate in the reparations effort, but through that participation, transform themselves.
Jessica?
Let me see. There were a couple more. Oh, I really wanted to raise this. Robin Prouty, as a descendant of ancestors enslaved at St. Louis University and is currently moving toward reparative justice campaign against the university, how would you advise us to build coalition to assist us, and what would that look like?
I can talk about some coalition building. It's what I like to do. So I would definitely say that you should start with the groups that are already on campus. Identify as many Afro-descendant groups and adjacent groups as you can, because you also want to know your allies, but you also want to know what groups on campus might try to hinder your movement. If you remember the movie, or what was that show, Dear White People, that was filmed on the University of Minnesota campus, ironically, and that was pre-George Floyd. So think about that. So I think that it's important to reach out. Most of these groups have their leadership listed. Just do some basic Google research and reach out. Instagram, Facebook, reach out. They're all probably going to have multiple pages where you can find their contact information, and simply just introduce yourselves and ask for a one-on-one. I'm gonna start using organizer language, which is just basically a one-on-one deep dive meeting, which is you sitting down with the group or the individual, and you all finding out what your mutual self-interests are, and then what your collective interests are. And you start building your campaign from there. You also want to identify, again, are you bringing in groups from outside the university, or is this going to be solely internal with just students on campus and them building this campaign internally and pushing it out externally? But I love that you are leaning in that direction, and it really excites me. And if there's any way that the NCOBRA National Youth Commission could be of assistance, I will drop my email in the chat.
Thank you for that answer, Sister Lily X. Please put your email in the chat, because I think it would be really helpful for you all to be connected.
So do we have like one or two last questions?
I'm gonna try to get at least two more. This was raised, the executive order was raised twice. So this one is from Cam, but somebody else mentioned it too. Cam Howard asked, with the upcoming election and Democratic Party's enormous dependency on the Black vote, what ways do you see are needed to exploit the power for forcing the establishment of an executive order?
Folks have to join forces on this. There has to be a clear ask around the executive order. There needs to be agreement on what the executive order is going to say. Is the executive order, are we still shooting for this executive order on the commission, or are we shooting for a direct ask? What do we need to do to up the ante? I think there's been a lot of interest in activity, particularly even this week with the Freedmen's Bank revival that the federal government is doing, the U.S. Treasury is actually doing, which they are effectively sanitizing the original use of the Freedmen's Bank and Bureau. And so there's attention to this concept of reparation and remedy, But in that, form, they committed $3 billion to fund, Black businesses, right? Anything but reparations. So, I have many thoughts around this executive order strategy. And I'm also, I also think we need some additional strategies out of the executive order. I'm also in that camp of the EO strategy is not working for us right now. So I'm personally stuck.
I think it's a hard question. To me, it's a hard question. The larger, I think, issue at hand is that the Democratic Party doesn't care about Black people. Joe Biden himself got on the Breakfast Club and said, if you don't vote for me, you're not Black. That's how he really feels. That to me is so disrespectful. And he apologized afterward, but we know that he didn't really mean it. So I think there's a long-term problem, a long-term goal of really addressing, the Democratic Party and how they take advantage of Black communities and how they take for granted of the Black vote. Then he got up on stage and was like, I owe the Black community everything, and he hasn't. Okay, so I think that we have to address that, and I think to Dreisen's point, I think in the shorter term, to actually influence the White House through executive orders, I think through Congress is probably one of our best bets. And so we need more allies like Cori Bush. We need more allies like Jamal Bowman in office. And so I do think that political organizing is a part of reparations work. And how do we get more folks in office who are thinking about the transformative ways of reparations? So again, not just the economic aspect, but the political and cultural aspect, who can take our voices and pressure the White House. So obviously we can use our own voice in pressuring the White House, but it's always better to have representatives of Congress, both, on the representative side and the Senate side. And I know we have less on the Senate side, who are pushing the White House. So when we are calling or we're doing campaigns for executive orders in an upcoming election year, they actually listen to us.
And I would just like to say.
Oh, sorry, go ahead. All you.
I think she's frozen, so go ahead, Nicole.
Okay, I'll sneak in. I can get in here. Yeah, I think also a lot we're talking, and I would leave it to Dreisen to talk about the inside game stuff because no one knows better than her probably on this call. But I think that a lot of what we're talking about is a hypocrisy in the Biden campaign, right? How he required and needed the Black vote to win, and how he hasn't done anything, all these kind of offensive statements that he's saying. And we know that politicians only care about anything when they're running for re-election. And so there is, I think, a potential in this current political climate where the other side is erasing history. The other side is actually lashing out and going too far. What are they trying to do in an election year? Strike a contrast, right? And so I think there's a way to use that to push people more into, if they're going to cloak themselves in, the kumbaya, we're all equal, we're the ones who tell the truth version of this country. And within that, I think as they're trying to make themselves distinct from the other side, there's an opportunity to do some political leverage. I think it's very possible for Biden to executive order. I think it's very possible to create the pressure to make Biden sign an executive order, at least in lame duck. And we're going to try. We're going to do some actions at some point. So yeah, to come. But I do think that there's an opportunity in the hypocrisy, is what I'm saying.
There's an opportunity and a hypocrisy. I think we're going to end on that note. We really want to thank everyone. And I just realized that Jessica and Mitchell Arwar is a millennial also. So I'm the only baby boomer. I knew she wasn't a baby boomer. But I mean, hey, so millennials, this is your time. I mean, I'm just saying, and you all have definitely risen to the occasion where people like me can just sit back and retire and all that, because you got it. So again, thank you very much for joining this session of the Reparation Information Thought Series. Everyone stay tuned for the next one. Please take a look at the chat. There's loads of great information in there. And I just really wanted to thank all of our panelists, Kevin Cosney of the California Black Power Network, Dreisen Heath, with the Why We Can't Wait Coalition, Nicole, Carty of Get Free, Sister Lilly X and Cobra Youth Commission, Trevor Smith, the Narrative Lab and Queen AF USA, Miranda, Alexandria of Incoba, Chicago, co-chair chapter. So again, thank you. And thank you, Jessica Ann Mitchell, Arawar with the National Black Cultural Information Trust, and myself, Nikichi Taifa, with the Reparation Education Project. Till next time. Reparations now.